The towers they built on bones. The secret history of the World Trade Center. Power, destruction, and a neighborhood nobody was supposed to remember. Prologue. What they never told you. Here is what they left out of every speech, every dedication ceremony, every architectural award, every documentary, and every memorial. Before those two towers existed, before a single steel column was sunk into the Manhattan bedrock, before a single floor plate was bolted into place, before a single window offered a single New Yorker a view of the harbor from 1,000 feet up, there was a neighborhood. A living, breathing, economically productive neighborhood that had existed for 5 decades and employed 30,000 people and served customers from across the entire northeastern United States. Its name was Radio Row. And the people who decided to build the World Trade Center chose that specific location, on that specific land, occupied by those specific businesses, with full knowledge of what they were destroying. They did not stumble into a blighted wasteland and discover an opportunity. They identified a functioning community, labeled it expendable, used the legal machinery of the state to seize it over the objections of everyone who worked and lived there, and then buried the story so completely that by the time the towers were dedicated in 1973, the neighborhood they had replaced was already being erased from public memory. This is the story they buried. It begins not with steel and glass and architectural ambition. It begins with a man named Oscar Nadell, who inherited a radio part shop on Cortlandt Street from his father, who had built it from nothing and who ran it for 33 years until the morning in April of 1966, when city marshals knocked on his door and told him he had 2 hours to remove whatever he could carry. He filled some boxes. He left most of his inventory behind. He drove away as demolition crews prepared to tear down the building. Within a week, it was rubble. That rubble, along with the rubble of 800 other businesses, was pushed into the Hudson River to create landfill. The neighborhood that was destroyed to build the World Trade Center literally became the foundation for another real estate development next door. The towers stood for 28 years. The story of what was done to build them was buried for most of that time. On September 11th, 2001, the towers fell, and what remained was transformed into something sacred, a site of genuine American grief and genuine American heroism that deserves every ounce of the reverence it receives. But reverence for the tragedy of that day does not require forgetting the story of what came before. The people who built the World Trade Center counted on Americans never asking uncomfortable questions about the methods they used. They counted on silence and selective history and the human tendency to stop digging once a building becomes famous enough. This is the story they counted on you never hearing. Part 1. The city that was falling apart, and the man who saw an opportunity. The war ended in August of 1945, and America came home. Veterans returned to cities that had been economically transformed by the demands of wartime industrial production, and that were now facing a transition back to peacetime nobody had quite planned for. The suburbs beckoned. New highways were being built. The Federal Housing Administration was guaranteeing mortgages that made homeownership accessible to returning servicemen in ways it had never been before. Developers were carving former farmland into subdivisions as fast as construction crews could pour foundations. The American dream, in the post-war imagination, was increasingly located outside the city rather than inside it. Manhattan felt this pull acutely, and Lower Manhattan, the oldest, densest, most commercially complex part of the island, felt it most of all. The financial district had anchored American capitalism for generations. The streets around Wall Street and Broad Street had been the beating heart of the global economy for a century. But that economy was changing. Corporate headquarters began relocating in the late 1940s, drifting north toward Midtown or outward toward suburban office parks in Connecticut and Westchester County. The executives making these decisions preferred buildings with parking lots to buildings accessible only by subway. They preferred new construction with modern amenities to buildings erected in the 1880s with elevators that moved at the pace of modest ambition. The exodus accelerated through the 1950s with a momentum that city planners watched with increasing alarm. Buildings that had been fully occupied for decades now showed vacant floors. Property values in Lower Manhattan declined steadily. The tax base that funded city services eroded year by year. New York was watching its economic foundation crack, and the cracking was most visible in the neighborhood south of Chambers Street, where the oldest buildings stood on the narrowest streets, serving the smallest businesses. Into this picture of urban anxiety came David Rockefeller. Born in 1915, the youngest son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., David had inherited a position in American society that transcended ordinary definitions of wealth. The Rockefeller name was not merely rich. It was an institution, an American dynasty whose financial reach extended into banking, real estate, philanthropy, and politics in ways that made the family less a collection of individuals than a semi-permanent feature of the national landscape. David had studied economics at Harvard and earned a doctorate from the University of Chicago. He had done brief military intelligence work during the war. In 1946, he joined Chase National Bank, which would merge and grow into Chase Manhattan, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. By 1960, David Rockefeller was its chairman and chief executive. His office sat in the financial district. His family's investment vehicles owned substantial real estate throughout Lower Manhattan. When property values in the surrounding neighborhood began declining in the early 1950s, Rockefeller faced a choice that most people in his position never get to face. Not whether to accept a loss or minimize it, but whether to try to reverse the forces creating it entirely through an intervention of such enormous scale that it would transform the district rather than merely stabilize it. He chose transformation, and he spent the better part of a decade assembling the political, financial, and institutional machinery needed to make it happen. In 1956, Rockefeller organized what he called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. The name was designed to suggest a broad civic coalition, the kind of organization that sounds like it represents everyone. In reality, it was a private planning group controlled by Rockefeller and a small circle of major property owners whose portfolios stood to benefit directly from the redevelopment they were planning. The association commissioned studies from urban planners and architects. The studies, having been commissioned by the people who wanted a particular answer, reached that answer with reassuring consistency. Lower Manhattan required wholesale clearance and redevelopment. The existing buildings were obsolete. The street patterns were inefficient. The small businesses that populated the district generated insufficient rent revenue to justify expensive modern construction. What was needed was not incremental improvement, but dramatic intervention. The acquisition and demolition of entire blocks, replaced with modern office towers massive enough to attract the corporate tenants that would restore the district's prestige. The studies were not wrong about the buildings. Many of them were old. They lacked central air conditioning. The electrical systems had been upgraded over decades, but were not designed for contemporary office use. Elevators were small and slow. By the standards of a Class A office building in 1960, the structures on Radio Row were functionally obsolete. What the studies ignored, deliberately, systematically, and with full awareness of what they were ignoring, was whether those buildings' obsolescence for Class A office use had any relevance whatsoever to the businesses actually occupying them. The shops on Radio Row did not need central air conditioning to sell vacuum tubes. They did not need high-speed elevators to repair radios. The buildings were not obsolete for their actual uses. They were only obsolete for the uses that Rockefeller and his associates wanted to impose on the land those buildings occupied. That distinction would not be mentioned in the studies. It would not be mentioned in the press releases. And it would not be mentioned at the press conference in January of 1960, when the Port Authority of New York unveiled plans for a World Trade Center on the site currently occupied by Radio Row. The shopkeepers learned about the plan from the morning newspaper, like everyone else. Part 2. Radio Row. What was actually there? Before we go any further, it is worth pausing to describe what Radio Row actually was, because the story of its destruction is impossible to fully comprehend without understanding the specific texture of what was destroyed. The neighborhood occupied roughly 13 city blocks in Lower Manhattan, bounded by Cortlandt Street to the north, Liberty Street to the south, Church Street to the east, and West Street to the west. It had evolved organically over approximately 50 years into something genuinely unique. The largest electronics marketplace in the United States, and arguably the most concentrated collection of technical knowledge available to the American public anywhere in the country. The physical environment was modest by any aesthetic standard. 4- and 5-story buildings constructed cheaply in earlier decades. Storefronts with plate glass windows displaying merchandise crammed onto shelves. Second floors housing workshops where technicians performed intricate repairs under fluorescent lighting with tools accumulated over decades of practice. Upper floors serving as storage or as modest apartments for proprietors who lived above their work. Nothing about the architecture suggested grandeur or permanence. Everything about it functioned exactly as needed. The businesses themselves were a dense ecosystem of interdependent specialists. Repair shops fixing radios, televisions, and increasingly complex consumer electronics. Surplus dealers selling military equipment left over from wartime production. Oscilloscopes, signal generators, radar components, communications gear that had served on ships and aircraft and in field hospitals, and that was now available to anyone with the knowledge to use it. Component suppliers stocking vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, transformers, wire of every gauge and quantities ranging from single units to bulk industrial orders. Retailers offering the latest consumer electronics at prices that reflected serious competition between neighboring shops rather than the comfortable margins of a captive market. Most operations were family-owned. A significant number of the proprietors were immigrants or first-generation Americans who had built their businesses from initial investments measured in hundreds of dollars rather than thousands. They had identified an opportunity, learned a trade, built relationships with suppliers and customers, and created something economically substantial from the kind of modest starting point that American mythology celebrates when it is not actively destroying the actual examples of it. The social fabric of Radio Row was as important as its commercial function. Proprietors maintained extensive networks with their competitors, relationships built on the recognition that a thriving neighborhood benefited everyone, that a customer sent down the street to find a component you didn't stock was more likely to return than a customer sent away empty-handed. Technical knowledge flowed freely between shops. Suppliers shared information about new products. Experienced technicians trained younger ones. A teenager with an interest in electronics could get hired as a shop assistant and learn a trade through daily apprenticeship that no formal school was offering. By 1955, Radio Row businesses employed approximately 30,000 people directly. That figure included shop owners, skilled technicians, salespeople, delivery workers, and administrative staff. Annual revenues ran into the tens of millions of dollars. The businesses paid property taxes, sales taxes, and payroll taxes. They served a regional customer base. Electronics enthusiasts from across the northeastern United States made regular trips to Radio Row because nowhere else could you find a discontinued vacuum tube, get a technically sophisticated explanation of why your circuit wasn't working, or source components for experimental project from people who understood what you were trying to build. None of this impressed the people making decisions about New York's future. To the urban planners and politicians evaluating Lower Manhattan through the lens of mid-century modernization theory, Radio Row represented precisely what needed to be cleared away. The buildings were old. The businesses were small-scale. The streets were congested with the pedestrian traffic of people who knew what they were looking for. The neighborhood generated tax revenue. The studies acknowledged this, but it didn't generate the right kind of tax revenue. It didn't project the image of a global financial center. It didn't attract the corporate tenants whose presence would signal that New York was competing with the great cities of Europe and Asia. It was, in the language of mid-century urban renewal, blighted. And the designation of blight, as the business owners were about to discover, was not a neutral technical description. It was a legal weapon. Part 3. The mechanism. How they made it legal. David Rockefeller needed something that no private developer possessed. He needed the power of the state. The private financial calculations for a project of the scale Rockefeller was imagining simply did not work without government intervention. Acquiring 13 blocks of Lower Manhattan real estate from hundreds of individual owners, many of whom would refuse to sell voluntarily, would cost tens of millions of dollars before a single building was demolished. Environmental work and infrastructure upgrades would add tens of millions more. Construction costs for office towers of the height required to make the project economically viable would reach into the hundreds of millions. And all of this investment would be made in a market that was, by every observable indicator, moving away from Lower Manhattan rather than toward it. No private developer with the ability to do basic arithmetic would accept these odds. The city government couldn't help. New York in the early 1960s was already running substantial budget deficits. Mayor Robert Wagner had no funds for speculative real estate development on the scale being contemplated. Municipal bonds might cover a bridge or a sewage treatment plant. They could not finance the construction of the world's tallest buildings in a neighborhood that private investors were actively avoiding. That left the Port Authority of New York, and Rockefeller had identified it as the perfect instrument for his purposes long before he made any public announcement. The Port Authority had been created in 1921 as a bi-state agency jointly controlled by New York and New Jersey, with an original mandate involving transportation infrastructure connecting the two states. Over the following decades, under the leadership of Robert Moses's counterpart in the world of port and transportation development, it had accumulated a collection of extraordinary legal powers that no ordinary government agency possessed. It could condemn property through eminent domain, the government's power to seize private land for public use, with compensation determined by the government rather than the market. It could issue bonds backed by future revenues rather than current taxpayer guarantees. It was exempt from local zoning regulations that constrained ordinary developers. And crucially, it answered to the governors of New York and New Jersey, not to city councils or mayors or the voters who elected them. In 1960, David Rockefeller's brother Nelson was serving as governor of New York. The Rockefeller family now controlled both the vision for Lower Manhattan's transformation and a significant portion of the political mechanism needed to execute it. Austin Tobin, the Port Authority's executive director, had spent 2 decades building the agency into a powerful quasi-governmental corporation. He understood something fundamental about institutional survival. Organizations either grow or die. Standing still meant losing talented engineers to private firms. Watching political influence erode as elected officials questioned whether such broad legal powers were still necessary. Facing the slow institutional death of an agency that had accomplished its original mission. The World Trade Center proposal gave Tobin exactly what he needed. A massive construction project that would justify the Port Authority's existence, expand its portfolio, and cement its position as one of the most powerful agencies in the northeastern United States. The political alignment was, from Rockefeller's perspective, close to perfect. The planning had been done in private. The legal mechanism was in place. The political will existed at the governor level in both states. All that remained was the public announcement and the management of the resistance that would inevitably follow. On January 28, 1960, the Port Authority and the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association held a joint press conference. They unveiled plans for a World Trade Center to be built in Lower Manhattan at a projected cost of $280 million. The presentation included architectural renderings showing twin towers rising above every other structure in the city. The site was identified as the area bounded by Vesey Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. Anyone familiar with the neighborhood recognized the coordinates immediately. Oscar Nadell, who had operated his radio parts shop on Cortlandt Street for over 30 years, learned about it from the morning paper. No one from the Port Authority or the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had contacted him. No advance notice had been provided to him or to any of his neighbors. The first indication that his life's work was scheduled for demolition came from reading the New York Times over breakfast. He called other business owners. They had the same questions. Could the Port Authority actually do this? What were their rights? What recourse did they have? Who would they even contact for answers? The legal team, they pooled money to hire delivered discouraging news. The Port Authority's powers were broad. Courts historically deferred to government determinations that projects served the public interest. The blight designation, however questionable as applied to thriving businesses, would be very difficult to challenge. The business owners had rights, technically. Exercising them effectively was a different matter entirely. Part 4. The fight they were supposed to lose. The Radio Row business owners did not go quietly. Whatever the power imbalance between them and the Rockefeller Port Authority alliance, they understood that the only thing worse than fighting and losing was not fighting at all. They formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association. Oscar Nadell became one of its primary public voices. They hired lawyers. They organized press tours of the neighborhood, inviting reporters to walk the streets and see for themselves whether this was the blighted wasteland the Port Authority studies described. Journalists who accepted the invitation found functioning shops filled with customers, proprietors with decades of expertise willing to spend time explaining their trade, a commercial ecosystem that was undeniably old and undeniably unglamorous and undeniably alive. The coverage shifted slightly in their favor. A handful of reporters wrote pieces questioning whether what was happening to Radio Row truly served the public interest, or whether it was more accurately described as the exercise of government power on behalf of private real estate speculation. The narrative of inevitable progress, old things giving way to new things, the natural evolution of a modern city, developed some cracks. The Port Authority's response was to accelerate its timeline. This was not accidental. Tobin and his team understood that time was the opposition's most valuable resource. Every month of delay gave the business owners more opportunity to organize, to find political allies, to generate public sympathy, to introduce legal complications that might slow the project even if they couldn't stop it. The faster the condemnation proceedings moved, the less room existed for effective resistance. In 1962, the business owners filed suit in New York courts challenging the Port Authority's legal right to condemn their properties. Their lawyers' central argument was elegant and uncomfortable. Building luxury office towers for private corporate tenants did not constitute a public purpose as required by eminent domain law. The Port Authority was using government power to seize private property from American small business owners in order to benefit other private interests. That was not what eminent domain was designed for. The Port Authority's legal team countered that the World Trade Center would serve genuine public functions. It would house international trade organizations. It would provide offices for government agencies. It would promote commerce and economic development that would benefit the entire region. These public purposes justified the property seizures under established constitutional doctrine. In March of 1963, the New York Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the Port Authority. The judges accepted the agency's argument that promoting international trade served a legitimate public interest sufficient to justify eminent domain. The blight designation for Radio Row was not seriously contested. The business owner's fundamental objection, that the government was taking private property to benefit other private interests, was dismissed. The ruling removed the last meaningful legal barrier to condemnation. The Port Authority could now proceed with property appraisals and compelled sales. The shopkeepers had lost their strongest weapon. What followed was the appraisal process, which added its own particular injustice to the larger one. Port Authority assessors toured the Radio Row properties and calculated compensation values using methodology that systematically undervalued what the owners were actually losing. A building purchased decades earlier for $20,000 might be appraised at $30,000, reflecting some land value appreciation while ignoring inflation, replacement costs, or the specific economic utility of the location for the business it housed. Business goodwill, the accumulated value of customer relationships, supplier networks, and location advantages built over decades, received minimal weight. The cost of relocating specialized inventory, finding comparable space in a city where comparable space essentially did not exist, and rebuilding a customer base that had been developed over generations was barely factored into the calculations. Oscar Nadel's shop was appraised at a fraction of what he believed it was worth. The assessors looked at his lease terms, his inventory levels, his recent revenue. They produced a number that Nadel described as insulting. His business generated enough income to support his family and his employees. Starting over at the age of 60, in a city where the specific advantages of his location could not be recreated anywhere else, was not a realistic option. The compensation offered made the impossibility of his situation clear. He was being given enough to leave, but not enough to start again. Some owners accepted the settlements because they had no viable alternative. Some were elderly and had neither the energy nor the resources for a prolonged battle. Some calculated that continued resistance would only mean receiving the same inadequate compensation later after consuming whatever remained of their savings in legal fees. A handful held out as long as legally possible. They refused settlements and forced the Port Authority to pursue full condemnation proceedings through the courts. They knew they would ultimately lose. They chose to lose slowly and expensively, imposing whatever delay and cost they could on the project that was taking everything they had built. By 1964, the fragmentation of the community was accelerating. Some owners had relocated to other parts of the city, attempting to recreate what they had in Radio Row in locations that lacked Radio Row's fundamental advantage. The clustering of complementary businesses that made the whole more valuable than the sum of its parts. A shop that could thrive on Cortlandt Street because a customer could walk in looking for a specific component and, if that shop didn't have it, be directed to one that did 2 doors down. That same shop, relocated to a different borough without neighboring specialists, was a fundamentally different and less viable business. The ecosystem was being destroyed. The individual organisms could not survive outside it. Part 5. The architect and the contradiction he never acknowledged. The Port Authority needed an architect, not merely a competent one, but someone whose international reputation would lend credibility to a project that was already generating controversy. Someone who could be presented to the press as evidence that the World Trade Center aspired to genuine architectural significance rather than simply to maximum floor space at minimum cost. They chose Minoru Yamasaki. The choice carried layers of historical irony that apparently escaped notice or were noticed and ignored at the time of the selection. Yamasaki was a Japanese American. He had been born in Seattle in 1912 to immigrant parents who ran a small business. He had studied architecture at the University of Washington, supporting himself through part-time work in a period when Japanese Americans faced discrimination in professional settings that made his eventual achievements considerably more difficult than they would have been for a comparably talented white architect. He had moved to New York after graduation, worked for various firms, and built his reputation through talent and persistence over decades. When World War II arrived, Executive Order 9066 authorized the mass removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Yamasaki's family was sent to the internment camps. He avoided the same fate only because he was already living in New York rather than in a designated exclusion zone. But the experience marked him permanently. He had watched his parents lose everything they had built because the government decided their presence was inconvenient. He knew in his bones what it meant to have your life's work erased by official decree. Now, in the early 1960s, he was being asked to design the signature monument of a project that was erasing the life's work of hundreds of small business owners through exactly that mechanism. Official decree, backed by government power, in service of private interests that had successfully convinced the courts that their ambitions constituted a public purpose. Yamasaki never publicly acknowledged this parallel. Perhaps he was unaware of the specific details of how the site had been chosen and cleared. Perhaps he was aware and chose not to engage with the contradiction because declining the commission, the largest architectural project in the world, would have been professional suicide. Perhaps he found ways to rationalize that the towers, whatever their origins, would ultimately serve a greater good. All 3 explanations may be simultaneously true. Human beings are extraordinarily capable of not seeing what is inconvenient to see. By the early 1960s, Yamasaki had established himself as an architect with a coherent and genuinely humane design philosophy. His buildings emphasized light, openness, and human scale. He believed that architecture should inspire and comfort the people who used it, that buildings should acknowledge the reality of human psychology and human physical experience rather than simply maximizing the utilization of floor space. His earlier work featured natural materials, careful proportions, and attention to how spaces would actually feel to the people moving through them. The World Trade Center Commission required him to abandon most of these principles at the scale they were most important. The program was predetermined before Yamasaki received his design brief. 2 towers, 110 stories each. Floor plates large enough to accommodate the enormous office layouts that corporate tenants of the 1960s were demanding. An exterior structural system that would eliminate interior columns and maximize rentable square footage. The scale alone contradicted everything Yamasaki believed about humane architecture. Buildings designed to house 50,000 workers each, a population larger than many American cities, could not, by the nature of their program, be scaled to human experience in the ways that Yamasaki's philosophy demanded. He found ingenious engineering solutions within the constraints he had been given. The closely spaced exterior columns that gave the towers their distinctive visual rhythm were an engineering necessity. The building's structural system required a dense exterior tube to resist the enormous wind loads that 110-story buildings experience. But Yamasaki claimed they also served a psychological purpose. He was reportedly afraid of heights. The narrow column spacing made the windows feel less vertiginous, more contained, less like standing at the edge of an enormous drop. Whether this was true or rationalization is impossible to determine now. The windows could not open. This was standard for modern office towers where climate control required sealed building envelopes, but meant that 50,000 workers per building would spend their days in hermetically sealed boxes entirely, dependent on mechanical systems for breathable air, comfortable temperature, and the basic human need for a connection to the outside world that opening a window provides. The sealed envelope was a practical decision that treated the people who would work in the buildings as variables in an engineering calculation rather than as human beings with physical and psychological needs. Yamasaki designed gestures toward human scale at the ground level. A plaza with fountains and sculpture and trees, ground floor retail and restaurant space, lobbies with soaring ceilings that acknowledged the drama of arrival. These gestures were genuine and not without value. They could not overcome the fundamental nature of the program they were trying to humanize. In interviews and public statements throughout the design and construction process, Yamasaki discussed the aesthetic refinements, the careful proportions, the interplay of light and shadow on aluminum surfaces. He presented the towers as a humanist achievement, a celebration of international commerce and human ambition. Radio Row was never mentioned. The business owners who had been displaced to clear the site were never acknowledged. The architect, whose parents had lost everything to government decree, said nothing publicly about the hundreds of families experiencing the same loss on the ground beneath his towers. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps the commission required that silence as a condition. Perhaps he had made peace with it in ways we cannot reconstruct from the outside. The silence itself is part of the record. Part 6, Demolition. What was done and what was lost. The wrecking crews arrived in March of 1966. Demolition began on the eastern side of the Radio Row district, working systematically westward toward the Hudson River. The Port Authority had instructed its contractors to move quickly. Every month of delay carried continued costs and political risk. The opposition had been legally defeated, but the human drama of displacement was still unfolding, and prolonging it only extended the period during which sympathetic journalists might write stories and politicians might feel pressure to intervene. The first buildings to fall were the smallest and oldest. Crews punched through roofs, knocked down walls, and hauled away debris in dump trucks that lined the streets morning to night, carrying rubble to landfills in New Jersey. The work proceeded with industrial efficiency. Buildings that had stood for 70 or 80 years disappeared in days. Shop owners who had already vacated their properties came to watch from across the street. Some needed to witness the destruction of the places where they had spent their working lives. Others stayed away, unable to bear seeing it. The photographs from that spring show men in suits standing on sidewalks, watching piles of brick and splintered wood that had been their businesses. The expressions on their faces are the expressions of people experiencing a specific kind of loss for which the English language has no single adequate word. Not grief exactly, because grief implies death, and this was more like erasure. Not anger exactly, because anger implies the possibility of redress, and this was the end of that possibility. Not everyone had left. A handful of proprietors refused to acknowledge the condemnation orders. They remained in their shops, serving whatever customers still came, maintaining the fiction that normal commercial life could continue against the sound of demolition equipment one block over. The Port Authority obtained court orders authorizing physical removal. City marshals arrived with eviction notices. The remaining holdouts were escorted from their buildings. Their possessions were moved to the street. Oscar Nadell was among the last to go. He had operated his shop for 33 years. Every component on his shelves represented accumulated knowledge. Knowledge of suppliers, knowledge of manufacturers, knowledge of what customers needed and where to find it when you didn't have it in stock. That knowledge was not portable. It was embedded in the specific context of a specific location in a specific neighborhood where the human relationships that made the knowledge useful had been built over decades. When the marshals knocked on his door and told him he had 2 hours to remove what he could carry, Nadell filled boxes with inventory. He left most of it behind. There was no time to pack everything. There was nowhere to store it all. The business he had inherited from his father and spent 30 years developing was reduced to whatever fit in his car. He drove away. Within a week, the building was rubble. The human cost extended well beyond the 800 business owners who received inadequate compensation and lost businesses they could not recreate elsewhere. Each shop had employed people. Conservative estimates put the direct employment figure at 30,000 workers: technicians, salespeople, delivery drivers, administrative staff, apprentices learning the trade. Most of these workers received nothing from the Port Authority. The compensation settlements went to property owners and primary business operators. The employees who had spent years or decades working in Radio Row shops were simply out of work, with no severance, no transition assistance, and no acknowledgement that their displacement was part of the calculation. The communities hardest hit were the ones with the fewest alternatives. Radio Row had been, in a meaningful sense, one of the more meritocratic employment environments in mid-century New York. Technical skill mattered more than surname or skin color. Shop owners hired based on the ability to repair electronics and the knowledge to identify components, not based on social connections or family background. Black and immigrant workers who faced discrimination in mainstream professional environments had found in Radio Row a place where demonstrated competence opened doors. When a neighborhood was destroyed, those doors closed. The scattered businesses that relocated to other parts of Manhattan or to the outer boroughs could not recreate the clustering effect that had made Radio Row's economics work. The knowledge ecosystem, the informal network through which a young technician could move from shop to shop, learning different specializations, building a reputation, developing expertise that would support a career, ceased to exist. Those opportunities did not move to another location. They simply disappeared. Demolition accelerated through the summer and fall of 1966. Entire blocks vanished. The streetscape transformed from dense commercial buildings to open lots of rubble. Dust hung in the air. Jackhammer noise echoed through the district day after day. By December, most of the structures were gone. 13 blocks that had contained hundreds of buildings now stood empty except for debris piles waiting for salvage crews. The Port Authority conducted no archaeological survey. No systematic photographic documentation of the neighborhood was undertaken before demolition began. A few photographers captured images on their own initiative, but no comprehensive record exists of what Radio Row looked like in its final years. The neighborhood was being erased from the physical landscape, and, with the active assistance of selective historical memory from the public record, then came the debris problem. 800 demolished buildings produced an amount of rubble that significantly exceeded the Port Authority's initial calculations. Hauling all of it to New Jersey landfills would take months and cost millions. The agency needed a faster solution. They found one with the pragmatic disregard for downstream consequences that characterized the entire project. The rubble was dumped into the Hudson River. The demolished remains of Radio Row, the brick, the concrete, the wood, the glass, the steel, all of it was pushed into the water along the western edge of the construction site. The dumping created approximately 23 acres of new landfill extending Manhattan's western shoreline into the river. Battery Park City, the mixed residential and commercial development that would eventually rise on this land, was built on the physical remains of the neighborhood destroyed to build the towers. The community that was demolished to build the World Trade Center literally became the foundation for another real estate project. The irony was absolute and absolutely unacknowledged. Part 7, Building the Impossible and Discovering Nobody Wanted It. By early 1967, the site was clear. 13 blocks of Lower Manhattan stood empty, waiting for the construction that would transform them into the largest office complex in the world. The engineering challenges ahead were genuinely formidable and genuinely impressive. Achievements that deserve recognition on their own terms, separate from the moral questions surrounding the project's origins. The most immediate problem was the foundation. The towers needed to reach bedrock 70 feet below street level. But bedrock in Lower Manhattan sits beneath layers of soil and fill accumulated over centuries of development. And just 300 feet to the west ran the Hudson River. Traditional excavation methods were impossible. Digging an open pit that close to the river would allow groundwater to seep through the soil and flood the site. Engineers needed to excavate while simultaneously preventing water infiltration on a scale that had no precedent in American construction. The solution was a slurry wall, a technique used in European construction but never previously deployed at this scale in the United States. Workers would excavate a trench around the perimeter of the site, filling it continuously with a mixture of water and bentonite clay. The slurry was dense enough to prevent the trench walls from collapsing under their own weight. Once the trench reached bedrock, workers lowered steel reinforcement cages into the slurry and pumped in concrete. As concrete displaced slurry, it created a permanent underground wall, anchored in bedrock 3 feet thick, extending 70 feet down. This wall would form a waterproof barrier around the entire 16-acre site, what construction workers called the bathtub, holding back the Hudson River while excavation of the interior proceeded. Construction of the slurry wall began in 1967 using specialized equipment brought from Europe. Excavation of the interior removed approximately 1.2 million cubic yards of soil and rock, material that, like the demolished buildings before it, went into the Hudson River as additional landfill. By late 1968, the excavation was complete. The foundation pour began. Steel fabrication had been underway at mills in the Pacific Northwest for months. The structural system Yamasaki and his engineers had developed used prefabricated column units, each consisting of 3 exterior columns joined together and spanning 3 floors, weighing approximately 22 tons each. These units were shipped by rail from the Pacific Northwest to New York, a journey of weeks for each load. And the coordination required to keep construction moving at the pace the Port Authority demanded was itself an engineering achievement. The first steel for Tower 1, the North Tower, went up in August of 1968. Tower 2, the South Tower, began rising 6 months later. The Port Authority had decided to stagger construction, partly to spread costs and partly to allow lessons learned from the first tower to inform work on the second. The work was dangerous in ways that the official construction narrative consistently underemphasized. Iron workers operated at extreme heights in all weather conditions, on a site exposed to the unpredictable wind gusts that Manhattan's position at the confluence of rivers generated. Safety equipment was primitive by the standards that later decades would establish as minimally acceptable. Falls were a constant risk. The first fatality occurred in January of 1970. Carl Kapp, an iron worker, fell from the 44th floor. He was 36 years old. He left behind a wife and children. The Port Authority issued statements about safety protocols. Construction continued the next day, as it always does. More deaths followed before the towers were complete. The exact number remains disputed. Port Authority records acknowledge some fatalities, but likely undercounted workers who died from injuries sustained on site, but survived long enough to die in hospitals rather than at the construction zone. Estimates range from 6 to more than a dozen workers killed during construction. Each death was a family destroyed. The men who built those towers were skilled tradespeople doing dangerous work for wages that barely supported middle-class lives in one of the world's most expensive cities. They paid for the Port Authority's ambition, and by extension, for the Rockefeller family's downtown real estate portfolio, with their lives. By 1970, both towers were rising visibly above the surrounding Manhattan skyline. The closely spaced exterior columns that Yamasaki had designed were becoming apparent, a dense vertical rhythm that gave the towers a distinctive appearance unlike anything else in the city. When they surpassed 80 stories, they were taller than everything in Lower Manhattan except each other. The cost overruns had begun almost immediately. The initial estimate of $280 million proved to be a number that bore no relationship to the actual cost of building what was being built. Foundation challenges cost more than projected. Steel prices increased. Labor costs exceeded estimates. The innovative structural system required custom engineering at every stage, adding expenses that standard construction wouldn't have generated. By 1971, the projected total had climbed to approximately $600 million. By final completion, it would exceed $900 million, more than 3 times the original figure. The Port Authority covered the overruns by issuing additional bonds backed by bridge and tunnel revenues. The agency that had been created to manage transportation infrastructure connecting New York and New Jersey was now using toll payments from commuters crossing the Hudson to subsidize the construction of luxury office towers that were not attracting the private sector tenants they had been built to house. The occupancy problem revealed itself with painful clarity as the towers neared completion. The Port Authority had commissioned studies predicting strong demand from corporations involved in international trade. These projections proved to have been wishful thinking at best and deliberate misrepresentation at worst. Corporations engaged in global commerce saw no particular advantage in a building called the World Trade Center. They needed efficient telecommunications, convenient transportation, and proximity to clients and competitors. Lower Manhattan in the early 1970s offered none of these advantages. The real center of corporate New York was Midtown, Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, Madison Avenue, and the companies that mattered were staying there. By mid-1973, occupancy rates were catastrophic. The Port Authority had filled multiple floors by leasing space to itself, creating the spectacle of a government agency renting from itself to avoid the embarrassment of completely vacant floors. The state government, as a favor arranged through Governor Rockefeller, leased additional floors. These government tenants, the Port Authority itself, and various state agencies, accounted for a significant portion of whatever occupied space existed. Private sector leasing was, by any honest assessment, a disaster. The official dedication ceremony took place on April 4, 1973. Governor Rockefeller spoke. Port Authority commissioners delivered speeches about vision and achievement. Minoru Yamasaki attended. The narrative was triumph. Radio Row was not mentioned. The 800 businesses destroyed to clear the site were absent from the speeches. The 30,000 jobs lost received no acknowledgement. The families whose lives had been disrupted so the towers could rise were invisible at the celebration of the project their displacement had made possible. History had been edited in real time, and nobody in the room seemed particularly bothered by the editing. Part 8. From Rockefeller's folly to the city's skyline. The towers that were supposed to restore Lower Manhattan's prestige had, within a few years of opening, acquired a nickname in certain New York circles: Rockefeller's Folly. The architectural criticism was pointed. The closely spaced exterior columns were described as oppressive, a visual effect that made the buildings feel less like architecture and more like the walls of a very tall prison. The sealed windows, which prevented any direct contact between occupants and the outdoor environment, contributed to the sense of hermetic enclosure. The windswept plaza between the towers, elevated above street level and exposed to the gusts that 60-plus stories of tower created at ground level, was uncomfortable to cross and actively uninviting as a public space. People avoided it when they could. The financial criticism was equally pointed. The Port Authority was covering operational losses through bridge and tunnel revenues. Commuters paying tolls on the George Washington Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel were effectively subsidizing empty office floors in a building that private investors had declined to finance. This arrangement violated the Port Authority's implicit compact with the public, the understanding that its revenues would be used for transportation infrastructure, in ways that generated genuine political anger. David Rockefeller's reputation in New York civic affairs suffered. He had championed the World Trade Center as the solution to Lower Manhattan's decline. The solution was consuming money, generating headlines about empty towers, and producing nothing like the corporate activity it had been designed to attract. His influence in the conversations that shaped the city diminished perceptibly, and something happened that nobody planned and nobody could take credit for. The towers began to become part of the city, not through clever marketing or reduced rents or government subsidies, though all of those things occurred. The towers became part of New York through the slow, accumulative process by which any permanent feature of a landscape eventually becomes inseparable from how that landscape is understood. They were there. They were enormous. They were visible from great distances on clear days. Approaching Manhattan by water, by air, or from New Jersey, you saw them first. Two rectangular towers rising above the irregular skyline like an exclamation point at the end of a very long sentence. The observation deck on the South Tower's 110th floor opened in December of 1973 and immediately became one of the city's most popular tourist destinations. 2 million visitors annually paid for the experience of standing at the top of the world and watching New York unfold below them in every direction. The views were, by any honest assessment, extraordinary. From that elevation, the city revealed its geography in ways that street level never could. The rivers on both sides, the bridges connecting the boroughs, the dense grid of streets stretching toward the horizon, the harbor beyond. The restaurant Windows on the World, which opened in 1976 on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower, became a destination in its own right. The combination of excellent food and views that no other dining room in the world could match drew both tourists and serious diners. Business executives brought clients. Couples celebrated anniversaries. The experience justified its considerable expense. Popular culture absorbed the towers in ways that cemented their place in the city's identity. The 1976 King Kong remake used the South Tower as its climactic setting, with the enormous apes scaling the exterior while helicopters circled, an image that embedded the towers in the American imagination in ways no Port Authority press release could have accomplished. Film set in New York included the towers automatically. Postcards and guidebooks featured them on their covers. Photographers composed their establishing shots of Manhattan to include them. By the mid-1980s, occupancy had reached 90%, not through the prestigious international trade organizations that had justified the project, but through financial services firms that needed the space and found the rents competitive, law offices serving the financial industry, government agencies that had expanded their presence over the years, and the ordinary businesses that fill buildings when buildings stop trying to be exclusive and start trying to be useful. The Port Authority was finally collecting enough rent to cover operating expenses and begin servicing its debt. The financial disaster of the opening years had been overcome through time and market adjustment. The vision had been wrong. The method had been wrong. The specific businesses that were supposed to anchor the complex had never materialized. But the towers were there, and eventually enough tenants came to fill them. Radio Row existed in 1985 only in the memories of people who had worked there and the files of lawyers who had unsuccessfully fought the condemnation 2 decades earlier. Oscar Nadell had died. His shop was a reflecting pool. The 30,000 jobs had been replaced by a different 30,000 jobs in a different economy, serving different industries, with no institutional memory of what had existed before. David Rockefeller never publicly addressed what had been done to make the World Trade Center possible. His public statements about the project, consistent across decades, focused on urban renewal and economic revitalization and New York's future as a global city. The methods used, the private planning sessions, the manufactured blight designation, the legal machinery wielded to dispossess hundreds of families, were not part of the narrative he offered. Austin Tobin had died in 1978. Minoru Yamasaki had died in 1986. The people who had made the decisions that shaped the project were gone, and the specific history of those decisions was settling into the sediment of institutional memory, where uncomfortable facts tend to reside. Part 9. The Bomb in the Garage and What It Revealed. February 26, 1993. A Friday morning, ordinary in every external detail. At 12:17 in the afternoon, a truck bomb exploded in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. The device, a urea nitrate bomb packed into a rental van by a group with connections to extremist networks, detonated with enough force to blow a crater 5 stories deep through the parking structure. The blast killed 6 people immediately and injured more than 1,000 others. Smoke and toxic fumes poured into the building through the ventilation systems, through the same mechanical infrastructure that maintained breathable air in sealed towers where no window could be opened. The evacuation of 50,000 workers from buildings with no natural lighting in the stairwells, no way to open windows for fresh air, and elevator systems that immediately shut down in the emergency took hours. People descended in the dark, some from floors above 90, guided by emergency lighting and the voices of others. The experience was terrifying and revelatory in equal measure. It revealed that the tower's engineering achievements, the sealed envelope, the mechanical ventilation, the sky lobby elevator system that optimized efficiency while creating bottlenecks in emergencies, had been designed around normal operating conditions rather than catastrophic failure. The same features that made the buildings efficient and climate-controlled in ordinary circumstances became acute problems when those systems failed. 50,000 people in 2 buildings with no way out except the stairs. In buildings where the stairs were not designed to move 50,000 people quickly. In buildings where any smoke in the stairwells would accumulate rather than dissipate through windows that didn't exist. Security was enhanced significantly after the 1993 attack. Vehicle access to the underground parking areas was restricted. concrete barriers were installed. The Port Authority spent millions on hardening the complex. Experts reviewed the security protocols and concluded that the facility was now adequately protected. The possibility that the towers might face a different kind of attack, from above rather than below, from the air rather than the ground, was not seriously considered in the security reviews that followed. Life returned to normal. The towers filled again. The 1990s brought the closest thing to genuine success the World Trade Center had ever experienced. Occupancy remained consistently above 90%. Rental income was strong. The observation deck and windows on the world were profitable. The financial structure that had been so precarious at the opening was finally stable. The towers had been standing for nearly 30 years. An entire generation of New Yorkers had grown up with them as permanent fixtures. Children born after the towers opened had no personal memory of the neighborhood that had preceded them, no context for the controversy that had surrounded their construction, no connection to the families whose displacement had made the towers possible. Radio Row was history in the truest sense. It had happened, and almost no one living remembered it happening. Part 10. The morning that changed everything, and the memory it made impossible. September 11th, 2001 began as a clear morning in New York. The sky was the particular blue that appears over Manhattan on early autumn days when the summer humidity has finally departed and the air carries a clarity that makes every building edge sharp against the background. 50,000 people were at work in the towers. Another 100,000 were moving through the complex on their way to other destinations. The subway station beneath the complex, the PATH trains connecting Manhattan to New Jersey, the shops and restaurants that lined the interior concourse. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors. At 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59. The North Tower fell at 10:28. 2,977 people died. What happens to a building when it falls is that it stops being a building and becomes something else. Becomes, in the specific case of the World Trade Center, a place of grief so profound and so nationally shared that every other story attached to the location recedes into inaudibility. The controversy over Radio Row's destruction, already largely forgotten by 2001, became completely inaccessible in the face of what happened on that September morning. The Port Authority's dubious use of eminent domain, the inadequate compensation paid to displaced business owners, the selective history maintained by everyone who had the power to tell a different story. None of this was speakable in the immediate aftermath, and very little of it became speakable again in the years that followed. The site became a memorial. The footprints of the two towers were preserved as reflecting pools. The names of the dead were inscribed on bronze panels that visitors could touch. A museum was built to preserve the experience of that day and the days that followed. The testimonies of survivors, the possessions of the lost, the documentary record of rescue and recovery. One World Trade Center, built on a portion of the original site and opened in 2014, rises to 1,776 feet, a height chosen for its symbolic resonance with the year of American independence. It is the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. It is designed to be more resilient, more secure, more explicitly a statement of American continuity in the face of the attack that destroyed its predecessors. Radio Row is not mentioned in any of the memorial materials. The 800 businesses destroyed to clear the original site have no plaque, no acknowledgement, no place in the official narrative of the World Trade Center's meaning. Oscar Nadell and the other shop owners who lost their life's work in the 1960s are absent from the historical record that the memorial presents to the millions of people who visit each year. This is not a criticism of the memorial. The people who died on September 11th deserve every dimension of the reverence and grief and formal remembrance that the site provides. The argument is not that Radio Row's story should replace or diminish that remembrance. The argument is that these are not competing stories. They are parts of the same story, and a complete version of that story requires both. Part 11. What the story of Radio Row actually means. David Rockefeller died in 2017 at the age of 101. His obituaries praised his philanthropy, his decades of service to American financial institutions, his role in the civic life of New York. The World Trade Center was listed among his major achievements. The methods used to make it possible were not discussed. This is how power operates when it succeeds. Success obscures the means. The towers stood for 28 years. They became beloved. They were destroyed in an act of terrorism that gave them a significance their builders had not anticipated and could not have imagined. The story of Radio Row, of the functioning community that was labeled blighted and seized and demolished and dumped in the river, was buried under layers of architectural achievement, financial complexity, popular culture absorption, and finally genuine national tragedy. But the questions that Radio Row's destruction raises are not historical curiosities. They are structural questions about the relationship between government power and private interests that have not been answered by time or by the tower's eventual redemption in public memory. Does government have the right to seize private property from functioning businesses and hand it to other private interests, as long as the beneficiary is prestigious enough and the legal doctrine of public purpose is applied broadly enough? The courts in 1963 said yes. The Port Authority could condemn Radio Row because the World Trade Center would house international trade organizations and promote commerce. And promoting commerce was a public purpose, and a public purpose justified eminent domain. The argument was legally sound and morally hollow. The international trade organizations that were supposed to anchor the complex never dominated it. The prestige corporations that were supposed to flood the towers with tenants spent the entire first decade mostly declining to move in. The economic revitalization of Lower Manhattan that was supposed to justify the displacement of 30,000 workers took not years, but decades to materialize. And when it did, it was driven by market forces rather than by the specific vision that Rockefeller and Tobin had championed. Meanwhile, the businesses that were destroyed were not blighted in any meaningful sense. They were old and unglamorous and unfashionable and small, and they employed 30,000 people and served a regional customer base and generated tax revenue, and preserved technical knowledge and provided economic mobility for communities that face discrimination elsewhere. The blight designation was a legal fiction designed to make eminent domain available for a purpose it was not designed to serve: the clearance of functioning small businesses so that valuable real estate could be transferred to developers with the right political connections. This pattern did not begin with Radio Row, and it did not end there. Urban renewal projects in the mid-20th century destroyed working-class and minority neighborhoods across dozens of American cities under the same legal framework and with the same selective use of blight designations. The specific genius of the Rockefeller-Port Authority alliance was the scale of the project and the prestige of the end result, which meant that the story of what was done to clear the site was more thoroughly buried than in most comparable cases. The lesson is not that the World Trade Center should not have been built. It is that the methods used to build it were not justified by what was built. The legitimate goal of revitalizing Lower Manhattan's economy could have been pursued in ways that did not require the destruction of a functioning commercial community. The evidence for this is simple. The community that was destroyed was economically healthy. It was generating employment, tax revenue, and commercial activity. It did not need to be cleared because it was failing. It needed to be cleared because it was in the way. Being in the way is not a crime. The people who operated Radio Row had the same rights as any other Americans. They had built their businesses legally, on property they rented or owned legally, in a commercial district that had developed organically and served genuine public needs. The fact that more powerful interests found their presence inconvenient did not give those interests the right to remove them. The courts said otherwise, but the courts have been wrong before and will be wrong again. And the passage of time and the eventual success of the towers they were cleared to build does not retroactively make the courts right. Oscar Nadell drove away from his shop with boxes of inventory in his car. And within a week, the building was rubble. And within a year, the rubble was at the bottom of the Hudson River. And within a decade, the towers were rising on the site. And within 30 years, the towers were beloved. And within 31 years, the towers were gone. And the reflecting pools that mark where they stood are a genuine and appropriate tribute to genuine and terrible loss. And Radio Row has no plaque. Epilogue: the questions that remain. The site at the southwestern tip of Manhattan is now both a memorial and a functioning business district. One World Trade Center rises above the reflecting pools. Office buildings, hotels, and residential towers occupy land that was once Radio Row or Hudson River, or the rubble of Radio Row pushed into the Hudson River. The neighborhood south of Chambers Street that was losing corporate tenants in the 1950s has, over the course of a half-century of transformation, become one of the most valuable commercial districts in the world. None of this happened the way the Rockefellers and Austin Tobin planned it. The timeline was wrong by decades. The tenant mix was wrong. The financial projections were wrong. The specific vision, a prestige complex for international trade organizations that would anchor a revitalized global business district, never materialized as described. What actually happened was that the market eventually caught up to a massive infrastructure investment that the government had made at public expense, and the resulting economic activity was real and valuable, though it bore only a passing resemblance to the justifications offered for the displacement of 30,000 people. The World Trade Center Memorial is one of the most powerful public spaces in the United States. Standing at the edge of the reflecting pools, watching water fall into the void, reading the names inscribed in bronze, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what happened there on one September morning. The grief is real. The loss is real. The memorial honors both appropriately. And a few blocks away, in the library archives and in the oral histories recorded before the last of the Radio Row veterans died, there is another story. A story of a man named Oscar Nadell who filled boxes in 2 hours and drove away from 33 years of his life. A story of 30,000 workers who lost jobs for which they received no compensation. A story of an elderly woman who had spent 40 years building a small electronic shop and was told by a government appraiser that 40 years of work was worth less than she knew it was worth, and that she had no recourse. A story of decisions made in private meetings between one of the richest men in America and the director of a quasi-governmental agency. Decisions that were presented to the public as inevitable progress rather than as what they actually were. Choices made by specific people with specific interests that had specific consequences for specific human beings who had no seat at the table where those choices were made. The towers are gone. The questions they were built on top of are still here. Who gets to decide what cities become? Whose vision of progress gets to override whose existing reality? When does public purpose justify private loss? And who decides when that threshold has been crossed? How do we balance the genuine good that large-scale development can produce against the genuine harm done to the communities displaced to make it possible? And what do we owe? What does any society owe to the people whose displacement it has decided to treat as the acceptable cost of its ambitions? Radio Row has no plaque, but the questions it represents will keep returning in different cities on different blocks, with different names on different storefronts, for as long as cities exist and power exists, and the gap between the two remains as wide as it was on the morning in January of 1960 when the shopkeepers of Lower Manhattan learned from the morning newspaper that their lives were scheduled for demolition. The wrecking crews thrived on schedule. They always do.